August 1977. Graceland. The summer heat presses down like a weight, but inside the mansion, the silence feels heavier still. It is not the quiet of rest. It is the stillness of something inevitable drawing closer. Elvis lies in his bedroom, his body drained, yet his mind restless, chasing unfinished thoughts. At his side is Joe Esposito, the man who has carried his burdens for decades, who has seen him in triumph and collapse. Tonight, Joe will not watch his friend walk on stage or sign another contract. Tonight, he will sit with a notebook in trembling hands as Elvis whispers the words he can no longer write himself. Each sentence is fragile, breaking the mask of the legend to reveal the man beneath, weary, grateful, haunted. As Joe's tears fall onto the page, the ink blurs, but the message becomes clearer than ever. This will not be another song or interview. This will be his final letter. And once written, it will no longer belong to Elvis alone. It will become a testament, a farewell, and a legacy. Words meant to outlast even the man who spoke them. What did Elvis choose to say when there was nothing left to perform, nothing left to prove, only truth to give? Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The summer of 1977 carried a strange heaviness, a weight in the air that no one in Elvis Presley's circle could quite put into words. The king was still touring, still stepping on stage, still summoning the old fire when the spotlight hit him. But behind the curtain, his body was rebelling. His last show, in Indianapolis on June 26th, had ended with thunderous applause, the crowd roaring until the walls of Market Square Arena trembled. To the fans, he was still Elvis. The voice, the charisma, the spark of something larger than life. But those closest to him had seen what happened after the curtain dropped. They had watched him stumble back to his dressing room, drenched in sweat, his chest rising and falling as though every breath was borrowed time. On stage, he smiled. Off stage, he struggled to climb into a chair. Joe Esposito, his longtime aide, had tried to intervene more than once. "Hey," he'd said, in the soft but urgent tone reserved for moments when the truth had to be spoken. "You can't keep doing this. Your heart's not going to take it. You need rest, real rest." But Elvis shook his head, pale skin shining with the residue of stage lights. "Joe, I still owe 'em. These people, they come here to see more than a show. They come because they believe in me. I can't let 'em down. Not yet." Those words silenced the room. Nobody dared argue when he spoke like that. And yet everyone could see the truth. His body was fragile, swollen from medication, his movements slower, his speech sometimes slurred. The man who once burned across America with wild energy now fought invisible chains, pills that dulled his pain but sharpened the decay of his health. Still, he refused to cancel dates. He flew city to city, nights blurring into one another, crowds screaming as if nothing had changed. To them, the king was eternal. To the men who carried his luggage and stood watch outside his door, he looked like a man unraveling. The newspapers had caught the scent of blood. By July, tabloids mocked him openly. "Elvis, a shadow of himself," one headline sneered. Another called him a parody of the man who once shocked America. The cruelest lines landed hardest, jokes about his weight, whispers that he was no longer relevant. Elvis read some of those words in silence, the pages trembling in his hands. He never responded, never gave interviews to defend himself, but the pain was visible in the way his eyes lingered too long on the print before folding the paper and tucking it away. Jerry Schilling, one of his most loyal friends, caught him one night staring out the window at Graceland's dark lawn. the city of Memphis humming faintly in the distance. Elvis's voice was quiet, almost detached. "You know, Jer, sometimes I think maybe I should write something down. Not a song, not a performance, just words. Something like a final address. For when I ain't around anymore." Jerry froze. Elvis rarely spoke so directly about death. "You're talking like that again, man. You don't need to." But Elvis raised a hand. "I ain't ready yet. Not tonight. But one day soon, maybe." The silence stretched, broken only by the whir of the air conditioner. Jerry didn't press further. He knew that when Elvis's mind drifted to those shadows, the worst thing to do was drag him back by force. Meanwhile, the fans remained blind to the storm. They saw the rhinestones, the jumpsuits, the grin that still flashed under the lights. They wrote letters by the thousands, some begging him to rest, most demanding that he never stop. He read a few when the mood struck him, and sometimes the simplest lines made his throat tighten. "Don't leave us, Elvis. We need you." That need became a kind of cage. The more fragile he felt, the more he convinced himself he had to give. The doctors who hovered around him grew more desperate. Blood pressure readings told their own grim story. His heart, battered by years of stress, diet, and chemicals, was running on fumes. They pleaded, fewer shows, fewer flights, fewer nights chasing the illusion of endless youth. But Elvis brushed them aside. He insisted that the people still wanted him, and until his last breath, he would answer. And yet, in private, he knew the cracks were widening. Some nights he woke drenched in sweat, clutching his chest, whispering prayers under his breath. Other nights, he sat at the piano in his bedroom, fingers heavy but still coaxing out fragments of gospel hymns that had once steadied him as a boy in Tupelo. He would hum the old lines, soft, halting, fragile, and for a few moments he sounded like the young man who once dreamed of lifting the world with song. But dawn always returned, and with it, the mask. The press saw only a man in decline. His fans saw only a legend refusing to fall. His friends saw both, and they carried that knowledge like a burden. One evening in late July, Joe found him in the upstairs office, leafing through a Bible that lay open on the desk. The room smelled faintly of cigar smoke and the sweet tang of medication. Elvis didn't look up at first. Then, without warning, he said, "Joe, when it comes, I don't want the story to be about how I fell. I want it to be about what I gave. Do you understand?" Joe nodded, throat too tight to answer. For all the glitter, for all the spectacle, there was a man inside the legend who knew he was running out of time. A man who felt the claws of mortality pressing closer with every heartbeat. And though he never admitted it to the crowds that adored him, to the world that mocked him, to the doctors who warned him, he admitted it in fragments to the few who had stood by him longest. He was carrying something inside him, something unsaid, a message, a final truth. And though he wasn't ready to let it out yet, the thought of it haunted him more with every passing night. The silence before the storm was settling over Graceland, and Elvis, the man who had once shaken the earth with his voice, now found himself listening to the quiet, wondering how many songs he had left to sing. August in Memphis carried a heat that pressed on the skin like a weight. At Graceland, the air conditioners hummed constantly, but they couldn't lift the atmosphere that had settled over the mansion. The house had always been full of noise, friends drifting in and out, music playing at odd hours, laughter from the kitchen, the footsteps of staff moving through long hallways. But by mid-August 1977, sound seemed drained from the walls. Conversations shrank to whispers. Even the guards at the gate spoke with unusual caution, as though the entire estate had fallen into a kind of waiting silence. Elvis spent most of his time upstairs, the private wing sealed off from the world. Few dared knock on his door unless summoned. When he emerged, it was brief, sometimes to sit at the piano for a few minutes, sometimes to drift into the kitchen late at night for a small plate of food. But mostly, he remained in his bedroom, blinds drawn, the light of a lamp throwing long shadows across the carpet. Records spun endlessly on the player. George Jones, with his mournful drawl. The gospel harmonies that had once lifted Elvis's spirit in church pews as a child. He would sit back, eyes half closed, lips moving faintly with the lyrics. One evening, Joe Esposito was called in. Elvis was stretched across the bed, a pen resting on the nightstand, but the pages before him were blank. "Joe," he said quietly, "get that notebook. I can't put it down myself right now, but I need you to write something." Joe sat, notebook in his lap, pen ready. Elvis spoke slowly, the words straining as though pulled from somewhere deep inside. "Music is a gift. It lifts you. It carries you. But it can also eat you alive. It can take more than it gives. People think it's all glory, but sometimes it's a weight, heavy as a stone." He paused, closing his eyes. His breathing was labored, shallow but steady. Then he added, "Still, I wouldn't trade it. Because when a voice reaches another soul, when it makes somebody feel less alone, then it's worth the cost." Joe scribbled, uncertain whether these were meant for a future speech, a private confession, or something more final. Elvis turned his head slowly, eyes meeting his friends. "Don't show this to anybody. Not now. Just keep it." The notebook closed with a snap, and the room fell back into silence, the only sound the crackle of the record spinning on. Downstairs, the staff moved cautiously. They noticed how meals returned untouched, how requests came less frequently, how the man who once roamed the house in bursts of energy now kept to a single room. Guards exchanged uneasy looks at the gate. Phones rang constantly. Business managers, promoters, reporters. But more often than not, the calls went unanswered. Those who did pick up offered vague reassurances. "The Colonel will handle it. Elvis is resting. Everything's fine." But the truth was written in every worried glance exchanged in the kitchen, every hushed word spoken in the halls. One afternoon, Priscilla arrived with Lisa Marie. Their visits were never simple, but this time the atmosphere was heavier than usual. Elvis didn't come down at first, leaving mother and daughter to sit awkwardly with the staff. Lisa Marie, only 9, fidgeted with a deck of cards on the coffee table, her bright presence a sharp contrast to the gloom pressing over the house. Priscilla whispered with Joe in the hallway, her voice tight with frustration. "Why won't he see her? She doesn't understand. She thinks he's angry with her." It was nearly an hour later when Elvis finally appeared. He wore a loose robe, his hair carefully combed, but his eyes tired, his skin pale. Lisa Marie ran to him instinctively, and for a few minutes the years and troubles fell away. He lifted her onto his lap, his face softening as he asked about school, her favorite songs, her friends. But the conversation, while tender, carried an unspoken weight. He looked at her as if memorizing every expression, every laugh. Priscilla, watching from a distance, felt a knot tighten in her chest. Later, alone with Joe, Elvis broke the silence. His voice was steady, but there was no mistaking the gravity. "My time's running out, Joe. I feel it. I know my body better than any doctor does. This ain't just exhaustion. It's the end moving closer." Joe tried to brush it aside, telling him he was overtired, that a break would fix things. But Elvis only shook his head. "No, this is different. I can hear it in my own breath. The clock's winding down." The words weren't dramatic. They weren't spoken with fear. They were delivered like a fact, the way a man might speak about the weather turning before a storm. And in that moment, Joe realized Elvis wasn't clinging to illusions anymore. He was staring directly at what was coming. Graceland in those days felt like a theater where the curtain was drawn, but everyone could hear the actors shifting behind it. Ordinary tasks continued. Meals prepared, cars washed, schedules discussed. But underneath was the knowledge that something irreversible loomed. Visitors noticed it too. A friend who stopped by later described the house as too quiet, like a church after the service is over, when the benches are empty, but you still feel the prayers hanging in the air. Behind the locked bedroom door, Elvis wrestled with memories, regrets, and flashes of clarity. His world had shrunk to a handful of rooms and a circle of people he trusted. Outside, the world speculated, gossiped, and demanded. Inside, time seemed to slow. Each hour waited with anticipation of the inevitable. And though no one could yet name what was coming, everyone inside Graceland felt it pressing closer with each passing night. The night of August 15th, 1977, pressed down over Graceland like a blanket too heavy to move. Upstairs, the lamps cast a faint amber glow in Elvis's bedroom, the air thick with the smell of medicine and the faint hiss of the record player spinning at low volume. He was restless, shifting beneath the sheets, unable to find comfort. Hours had passed in silence, broken only by the occasional cough or the creak of the house settling in the late summer heat. At last, he reached for the phone and called Joe Esposito. His voice was weaker than usual, frayed at the edges. "Joe, come on up. Bring a pad, something to write on." When Joe entered, Elvis was propped against the pillows, his face pale but his eyes unusually clear. The bed table was cluttered with pill bottles, glasses of water, and a half-eaten sandwich, untouched for hours. Joe sat beside him with a notebook, waiting. "I can't hold a pen tonight," Elvis admitted quietly, "but I can still talk. And I need these words put down. I need them saved." Joe nodded and uncapped his pen. The room seemed to contract, shutting out the rest of the house, as if only the two of them existed inside that dim-lit chamber. Elvis drew in a slow breath, closed his eyes, and began. "It ain't about the money. It ain't about the shows or the records sold. That was never the truth of it. Music. Music was always about connection. A gift from God, I think. Something that passes through you, not from you. Like a river. You don't own the river. You just let it run through your hands." Joe scribbled furiously to capture every word, but the cadence was unlike anything he'd heard before. It wasn't Elvis, the performer, speaking. It was Elvis, the man, stripped of the armor of fame. Elvis's voice weakened, but he pressed on. "I've been carried by it, saved by it, but I've been trapped by it too. There's a price to singing to the world. You give yourself away, piece by piece, until you're not sure what's left inside. Sometimes I wonder if the songs kept me alive, or if they're the very thing that's breaking me down." Joe glanced up, startled by the rawness of the confession. He saw Elvis's hands trembling slightly against the sheets. Then the subject shifted. Elvis's voice broke as he whispered, "Write this, Joe. Write that I thank the Lord for my little girl. Write that she's the light that never failed me, even when I failed myself." His eyes glistened. He turned his head toward the ceiling, swallowing hard, but the words cracked. "Tell her. Tell her she was my reason." Joe's vision blurred. He bent over the page, but tears fell faster than his pen moved, blurring the ink in places. He tried to wipe them quickly, but Elvis noticed. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Elvis murmured, almost with relief, "That's good, Joe. That's how I know it's true. Truth should make a man weep." The silence stretched again. Outside, the cicadas buzzed in the humid Memphis night, a faint counterpoint to the labored breaths in the room. After several minutes, Elvis continued, softer now, as though speaking to himself as much as to his friend. "One day, when I'm gone, these words might matter more than any record I ever made. But not yet. Don't let anyone see them. Not until I say so. You promise me that?" Joe hesitated, his throat tight, then nodded. "I promise." Elvis closed his eyes, his body sinking deeper into the mattress. "Good. We'll stop here for now." The notebook lay heavy in Joe's hands, ink smudged where his tears had fallen. He looked at Elvis, who had drifted into a shallow doze, lips moving faintly as though repeating the words he had just dictated. The sound of the record player's needle scratching against the groove filled the room. Joe sat motionless, staring at the words on the page. He had served Elvis for decades, seen him at his wildest, his brightest, his darkest. But never had he felt so close to the unvarnished soul of the man. For the first time, he held something that wasn't meant for the stage, or the cameras, or the colonel's contracts. It was a truth too delicate for the world to see. He closed the notebook carefully, sliding it into his jacket pocket as though protecting a sacred relic. He wiped his face, stood, and turned toward the door. Behind him, Elvis shifted faintly in his sleep, whispering something inaudible. Joe paused, listening, but the words dissolved into the static of dreams. The door clicked shut. The upstairs hallway was silent, shadows stretching long across the carpet. Downstairs, the house carried on in its uneasy quiet. No one aware that in the room above, Elvis Presley had spoken what might be the last unguarded testament of his life. And Joe, clutching the notebook against his chest, felt the crushing weight of a secret too heavy to share and too precious to ever lose. The morning of August 16, 1977, dawned heavy and muted over Memphis. The sun rose behind a thin veil of haze, the air already thick with late summer heat. Inside Graceland, the staff moved with the subdued rhythm of people carrying unspoken dread. Even the usual chatter in the kitchen was absent. Footsteps echoed in the halls as if the house itself knew what was coming. Upstairs, Elvis stirred from a restless night. His face was pale, the lines around his mouth deepened by fatigue. The previous evening had drained him, but he forced himself to rise, pushing back the blanket as though sheer will could carry him. Lisa Marie was waiting. She had spent the night at Graceland, and now, dressed in a simple cotton dress, she hovered in the hall, clutching a small stuffed animal. When Elvis stepped out of his room, her eyes lit up, and she rushed to him. He managed a smile, lifting her gently, though his arms trembled under the weight. For several minutes, they sat together on the couch in the upstairs sitting room. He asked about her favorite games, her friends at school, the books she liked. She answered quickly, eager to please him, though she sensed a heaviness in his tone. Then, his voice softened. "You know I'll always be with you, baby. No matter what." She frowned, not fully understanding. He kissed her hair and held her close, the moment stretching into silence. For Elvis, it was less a promise than a farewell disguised in gentleness. Later, he asked Joe Esposito to come into the bedroom with the notebook from the night before. Elvis reclined in his chair, listening quietly as Joe read aloud the words he had dictated, lines about music, faith, and gratitude. Elvis nodded faintly, eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the walls. When Joe finished, Elvis spoke slowly, almost as if etching the thought into stone. Add this. A man lives on as long as someone remembers him. Doesn't matter what the papers say, doesn't matter what the world thinks. If they carry you here, he tapped his chest, then you ain't gone. Joe wrote the words, feeling the weight of their finality. Elvis leaned back, closing his eyes, lips parting in something between a sigh and a prayer. The morning unfolded in small fragments. A phone call from the colonel's office about the upcoming tour stop in Portland. A quick check-in from a bodyguard, the sound of Lisa Marie laughing faintly down the hall. Ordinary pieces of a day that, beneath the surface, pulsed with dread. By late morning, Elvis moved slowly toward the bathroom, clutching a paperback book. He turned to Joe before closing the door. "Just a few minutes," he said, his voice light but weary. "I'll be right out." Joe nodded, though something in his chest tightened. He glanced down at the notebook in his hands, the ink still fresh from the new line Elvis had added. The words stared back at him, alive with urgency. A man lives on as long as someone remembers him. Minutes ticked by. 10, 15. The house outside the closed bathroom door hummed with routine. Phones ringing, footsteps moving across polished floors, guards talking quietly near the entrance. Upstairs, the silence deepened. Joe shifted uneasily, then knocked lightly. "E?" No answer. He waited. Knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Half an hour had passed since Elvis had entered. The unease spread quickly. First Joe, then other members of the entourage, exchanging tense looks. The house that had been filled with quiet anticipation now bristled with fear. The stillness of the closed door became unbearable, a silence that pressed harder with each second. What had begun as another morning at Graceland was curdling into something else, something irreversible. And inside, unseen by those waiting outside, time itself seemed to have frozen. The discovery came like a rupture. One of the staff finally pushed open the bathroom door, and the sight froze him in place. Elvis lay motionless on the floor, his body unnaturally still. For a heartbeat, the house seemed to go silent, as though the air itself refused to move. Then came the cries, urgent, panicked, calling for help. Joe Esposito rushed in, his heart racing, shouting for an ambulance as others knelt desperately beside the fallen man. The tight quarters of the bathroom filled with chaos, attempts at revival, frantic voices echoing off the tiled walls, the sharp clatter of bottles pushed aside. But even as they tried, a grim certainty seeped into the room. The emergency call was made. Within minutes, the mansion filled with the heavy thud of running feet, doors opening and slamming as medics were led upstairs. The corridor outside the bedroom became a blur of movement. Friends pressed against walls, staff whispering hurried prayers, guards blocking curious onlookers from approaching. Through it all, Joe kept the folded pages of the dictated letter pressed against his chest inside his jacket. He could feel the paper stiff beneath the fabric, as though it carried its own pulse. Every time he touched it, a wave of dread surged through him. These words were no longer a private reflection. They were, he realized with sickening clarity, a farewell. The paramedics worked in tense silence, their instructions clipped, professional. The sight of them trying to bring life back into the body that had electrified millions was unbearable to those watching. Every push of the chest compressions seemed to push the room further into despair. At 3:30 p.m., the attempt ended. A doctor's voice, flat and formal, broke the air. Time of death, 3:30. The words shattered those listening. For Joe, it was like hearing the world itself split open. A man he had lived beside for decades, who had been larger than life even in his most fragile moments, was suddenly gone. The room seemed colder, emptier, as if the spirit had already left. But there was no pause for grief. Almost immediately, the news leaked beyond the gates. One phone rang, then another, then all at once. Reporters, fans, industry contacts. Word spread with an unstoppable speed. By the time the body was removed from the house, the outside world was already convulsing with the shock. In Memphis, strangers on the street stopped in their tracks, radios blaring the impossible news. People wept openly, clinging to one another as if struck by a personal loss. In diners, in gas stations, in crowded living rooms, the reaction was the same: disbelief, followed by a flood of tears. Inside Graceland, the mood was starkly different. Where the outside world erupted in mourning, the house itself fell into a suffocating stillness. The staff huddled in corners, whispering in disbelief. Friends sat motionless, staring into space, too stunned to form words. For them, grief wasn't yet a public ritual. It was raw, private devastation. Amid this silence, a phone rang again. A journalist's voice on the other end, brazen and detached, asked Joe if he had access to anything personal: letters, recordings, objects, anything that could sell. The bluntness struck him like a slap. He hung up without replying, his hand shaking with rage. The world hadn't even paused to honor the man. Already, it was circling like vultures. The noise outside grew louder as fans began gathering near the gates, their cries rising into the humid air. Yet upstairs, Joe sat alone in a chair, the notebook still pressed against him. He pulled it out, staring at the inked lines blurred in places by his own tears from the night before. The words stared back like prophecy. Elvis had spoken of music as both gift and burden, of the price of connection, of the hope that memory outlasts the body. Now, with his death confirmed only minutes ago, the words had transformed into something sacred. The contrast was unbearable. A city crying in the streets, reporters dialing for a scoop, friends too stunned to speak, while in Joe's trembling hands lay the truest, final piece of Elvis's voice. And though the world outside had just begun to mourn, inside the walls of Graceland, the silence was total, as if the house itself were listening. August 18th, 1977. The day of the funeral. Memphis awoke to a sight that seemed pulled from another world. Streets choked with people, cars parked for miles along the roads leading to Graceland, voices humming in restless waves. Some had driven all night from neighboring states, headlights forming a procession that stretched across highways into the city. Others had walked for hours just to stand outside the gates. By morning, the crowd had swelled into hundreds of thousands. The atmosphere outside was electric with sorrow. Men in work shirts clutched transistor radios pressed to their ears. Mothers held children on their shoulders, whispering that they were witnessing history. Strangers embraced, tears running freely. A group of teenagers stood in a circle singing "Love Me Tender" in trembling harmony. The song rippled through the crowd until dozens joined in, voices fragile yet defiant. The line to view Elvis's body wound endlessly, stretching block after block, a human river flowing slowly toward Graceland. Some fainted under the heat, overcome by exhaustion and grief, but refused to leave even after being revived with water. To them, standing there was an act of devotion, the only way to repay what he had given them through his music. Inside the house, the scene was starkly different. Curtains were drawn, the air heavy with perfume and flowers. the hush of muffled voices barely rising above whispers. Family and close friends gathered in small clusters, speaking little, their faces drained. The sound of distant singing from the gates drifted faintly through the walls, a reminder of the world pressing in from outside. Joe Esposito sat apart from the others, the folded letter still hidden in his jacket. The paper seemed to burn against his chest. Several times he reached for it, pulling it halfway out before stopping, sliding it back into the pocket. He could not decide whether to destroy it, as Elvis had instructed, or to preserve it for those who might need to hear his final words. As the coffin was prepared for the procession, tension built among the inner circle. Voices rose in sharp whispers. Should the letter be kept private? Should it ever be shared? Some argued fiercely that it belonged only to Elvis's family, that the world had no right to it. Others believed the opposite, that his final thoughts were not for one person, but for everyone who had carried him in their hearts. Joe said nothing, though the debate raged around him. He pressed the jacket tighter, feeling the edges of the folded pages as if anchoring himself. Every word written there carried the weight of a man's last truth, and he feared both outcomes, keeping it hidden forever or unleashing it into a world already ravenous for fragments of Elvis's life. The funeral itself was a paradox of grandeur and grief. The coffin, polished and solemn, moved slowly as pallbearers carried it past rows of mourners. Outside, the crowd surged forward, restrained only by police and barricades. Some screamed Elvis's name. Others fell silent, pressing their hands together in prayer. The motorcade that followed stretched for miles, cars crawling through the streets of Memphis. People lined the sidewalks, waving, weeping, saluting as the procession passed. A helicopter hovered overhead, capturing images that would soon flash across television screens worldwide. To millions watching from afar, it looked like a state funeral, a farewell reserved for kings, and yet, for those closest to him, it felt like an intimate fracture. Every note sung by the gospel choir, every flower laid on the casket, every tear shed in private, carried the unbearable knowledge that the man behind the myth was gone. In the crowd outside, rumors began to circulate like sparks. Whispered voices insisted Elvis had left behind a hidden message, a note meant for his fans. The speculation spread quickly, carried from one stranger to another, until entire groups were repeating it as if it were fact. Some swore it was already in the hands of his friends. Others claimed the colonel had locked it away. Joe heard fragments of this gossip from the guards when he stepped briefly outside. The realization chilled him. The existence of the letter was already suspected, though no one had spoken of it aloud. The secret he carried in his pocket seemed to grow heavier by the minute. That night, after the burial, the city of Memphis glowed under candlelight. Thousands of fans kept vigil outside Graceland, their songs rising into the humid air. Inside the mansion, however, the silence was suffocating. The laughter, the late-night music, the constant motion that had once defined the house had vanished. What remained was a void no one knew how to fill. In that silence, Joe retreated to a corner of the room, hand pressing against the folded paper one more time. The words written there felt alive, like a voice that refused to die. He wondered if keeping them hidden honored Elvis, or betrayed him. The world was grieving, but Joe knew grief was only the beginning. Something inside those lines, something Elvis had chosen to speak in his final hours, would one day demand to be heard. The days after the funeral unfolded in a blur. Memphis was still draped in mourning, flowers piled high at the gates of Graceland, fans camped along the roadside as if waiting for him to reappear. Radio stations played nothing but his records, entire hours given over to the sound of his voice. Across America, the shock lingered. Conversations in barber shops, in diners, in churches, all circling the same thought. How could Elvis be gone? Inside Graceland, the mood was different. The house had become hushed, stripped of its usual rhythm. Friends lingered without direction, unable to disperse, as though leaving would mean acknowledging the truth. The upstairs rooms remained sealed, his belongings untouched, the silence broken only by the creak of floorboards and the distant hum of fans outside the gates. Joe Esposito sat one evening in Elvis's private lounge, a single lamp glowing beside him. The letter lay on the table in front of him, unfolded at last. He had read it countless times since that night, each line sinking deeper into him. He mouthed the words silently, then, with a deep breath, spoke them aloud to the empty room. The sentences carried no grandeur, no self-justification. They were plain, almost startling in their simplicity. Gratitude for the music, a confession of its burden, a plea for forgiveness where he had failed, and above all, a love that circled back to one person, his daughter. Joe's voice wavered as he read the final lines. Remember me, not for the noise, not for the lights, but for the moments the music made you feel less alone. As long as you remember that, I am still here. The weight of it crushed him. For a moment, he buried his face in his hands, overcome by the raw humanity of the man so often hidden behind rhinestones and headlines. When he finally lifted his head, he knew the decision could no longer be avoided. To keep the letter sealed would mean burying Elvis's last truth. To release it would mean betraying the promise of secrecy. Yet, as he read the lines again, he felt certain. These words were never meant to vanish in a drawer. They were meant to live, to do the very thing Elvis had asked, that his voice be carried forward in memory. The next day, he quietly made copies and shared them with a few of the closest confidants. The reactions were divided. Some clutched the pages with reverence, tears falling freely. Others shook their heads, insisting it was too private, that the public would twist it, sensationalize it. But already, the words had taken on a life of their own. News of a letter began to circulate, not from newspapers this time, but whispered from friend to friend. The existence of Elvis's final thoughts became a kind of legend, a shadow that both comforted and unsettled. And for those who heard even fragments of it, the effect was profound. Fans spoke of feeling as though he had reached out to them personally, assuring them that his spirit had not gone silent. Joe returned one evening to the same upstairs room where the words had first been spoken. The house was still, the crowd outside quieter now, but still present. He unfolded the original page again, running his fingers over the smudged ink, the blotches where his own tears had fallen during dictation. It felt less like paper and more like living proof that Elvis had chosen honesty in his final hours, when the stage was gone and only truth remained. He read the last paragraph aloud once more, the words filling the emptiness. Music and love outlast death. That's the gift. Carry it, and I'll never be far. For a long time after, Joe sat in silence. But this silence was different from the suffocating quiet of the days before. It wasn't absence. It was presence. The sense that the man who had filled arenas, who had shaken the world with a single song, had found a way to keep speaking even after his voice had fallen still. In the years to come, countless books would be written, rumors spun, myths invented, but none of them could erase the power of those words spoken in a dim bedroom on a humid August night. They were not for spectacle, not for profit. They were the last truth of a man who wanted to be remembered not as a legend, but as someone who gave his heart through music. And so, in that small room, Joe whispered a final promise into the quiet. "They'll remember, E. They'll carry you." Outside, faintly, a radio drifted through the Memphis night, playing the opening chords of a familiar song. A voice rose once more, rich, aching, alive. The king was gone. Yet the words on the page and the sound carried through speakers made it clear. Elvis had never truly left.